Hi BookTube. Welcome to another fiction review. Or is it? The title that we're looking at has been shortlisted for this year's Walter Scott Award for Historical Fiction. Now you would think that answers the question, wouldn't you? But I say, not really. You wouldn't think that it would be so difficult to decide, but that is the situation that we're in today. Today's title is Ancestry by Simon Mawer, published this year by Abacus, which is an imprint of Little Brown Book Group in London. Now, because this book is so unusual, what I've done is chosen some questions from my usual list that I use for fiction reviews, but also a couple that I would use for my non-fiction reviews. First question, can I pitch this book? This book is a hybrid. I mean, as far as I can tell, it is the first of its kind. Ancestry is, yes, in part, a work of historical fiction. This author has chosen a period of time and a location, and they're populating a fictional world with characters and real historical figures as well, whose lives are just filled out a bit. But what Simon Mawer does that is unique is he's using his own family history research. And that's the basis for just a couple of fictionalized narratives. But interspersed with those narratives, there are moments when the fiction is put on pause. And Simon Mawer steps into the text and it becomes more non-fiction. He comments in more detail about his research. And at the very end of the book, he takes just one fact about his genealogy, and he demonstrates how he could create several different fictional narratives from the same fact, which could explain what probably did happen. Let's talk the details of the book and how I got it. The 2023 Abacus edition of Ancestry is 414 pages long in paperback. Now, this was another borrowed book. If you watched my non-fiction book review on the 13th of July, which covered The Courtier and the Queen by Malcolm Deacon, you will know that now again I go into the office where I work and I find a book waiting on my desk. Borrowed books have a special category, but you think about it, if someone goes to the trouble to select one of their own books and bring it to you, they've done a bit of an algorithm in their head, haven't they? They've thought back to conversations and they've remembered areas of interest, and then they've scanned their own library and suddenly they spot a book and the two factors come together and they think, this will be a good match. And I tell you, they are way better at this kind of thing than Amazon, no doubt about it. And this particular book was a double bullseye on target, because not only have I enjoyed it, but even more so, the person who watches television in this house is also reading the book right now. It doesn't happen often that we read the same book. Our reading tastes are not the same, but we do have shared ground when it comes to anything historical. Let's look at what we know about the author. Simon Mawer was born in 1948. Both his father and his grandfather were in the Royal Air Force, so he was a typical military child with a family that moved around a great deal. His childhood was spent in England, Cyprus, and Malta. Now, to give him a stable education, of course, he had to go to boarding school, which he says he hated initially, but then he found a way to adapt. He attended university at Brasenose College in Oxford, and then he went on to teach biology, and he taught in many different places, in the Channel Islands, Scotland, back to Malta, in Rome. His first novel, Chimera, was published in 1989 when he was 40. He went on to write 13 more books, of which 11 were novels, and he currently divides his time between Italy and Hastings. Now, this is where I'm going to insert one of my non-fiction questions and asked, how is this book structured? Because it does have a definite structure. Appropriately, perhaps, Mawer is concentrating on the members of his family tree who also moved around a great deal. The book has 3 parts. The first part looks at his ancestor Abraham Bloch, who became a seaman apprentice at 15 to escape rural poverty in Suffolk. Part 2 looks at Corporal George Mawer, who joined the army in the 1840s, a time when the army did not have a great deal to do and soldiers were shifted from one place to another, one barracks to another, to prevent them from becoming too familiar with local people in case they were needed to help keep the peace. Then in 1854, George was called up to fight in the Crimean War. Part 3 looks at the aftermath of that story for George's family. Finally, there is an epilogue which brings together the Bloch and the Mawer families, and finally a credits chapter where Mawer mentions the sources that he used to get some of his historical detail. Back to fiction questions now. Does this book fit a genre label? Well, I say no, it does not. As far as I know, Ancestry is the only book quite like Ancestry, and that's not a criticism. Given the popularity of television series such as Who Do You Think You Are, I would not be surprised if a new genre emerged as a result of the publication of Ancestry. I don't know what you would call it, maybe speculative genealogy. And that leads nicely on to my next question. Is there anything readers should bear in mind if they're deciding whether or not to read this book? I say that reading it will feel different. It would be unwise to expect it to do exactly what a novel would do, that is, to tell a whole joined up story. The connection between the two family stories in this book, the only connection, is the author. And the author inhabits his own book. Here and there he steps in, more in part 3 than in other parts, which isn't something that happens in a novel, or at least, in my opinion, it would be better if it didn't. You really cannot successfully bring expectations to this book. You would be better to just let it be what it is, and then decide after you've finished whether you want more of the same. Next question, is there problematic content in this book? Yes, there is. There is sexual harassment, that is manipulative and deceptive behavior by men to entrap vulnerable women. What is the context and purpose of that problematic content? Well, the context is the reality of the times. Sadly, Simon Mawer fictionalized the lives of 2 female ancestors in a way which highlights what you could also find talked about by 19th and early 20th century authors. I'm thinking of H.G. Wells in Anne Veronica, Thomas Hardy in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and Ford Madox Ford in The Good Soldier. And what we see here also in this painting from 1864 by Berthold Woltz, entitled The Irritating Gentleman. Women risked their safety in the 19th century if they were not careful where they went unaccompanied, or what method of travel they chose, or who they shared personal information with. Mawer is not taking any artistic license by inventing more than one situation where a man took advantage of his gender and class to obtain what he wanted from a woman sexually, and then took advantage again of his gender and class to abdicate any responsibility for the consequences. Mawer ends Ancestry by congratulating the women. I'm going to quote now from page 414. Ultimately, it was the women who won through, the women who swam doggedly against the tide of history and dragged their children to the shore, thus saving them from destitution, setting them on the path to middle-class prosperity. Yet, by the time of this photograph, he's referring to a family photo that he's included in the book, these women had been largely forgotten. They are the real dispossessed, surely emblematic of thousands of others in the 19th century and before. Finally, any suggestions for related or follow-up reading? Reading Ancestry might make you curious to know more about the Crimean War, as it did me. I recommend Orlando Fige's book on the subject, and in my description box I'm going to include a link to a YouTube video where Orlando Fige's is being interviewed on the subject, and he talks about the significance of the Crimea to the current war that Russia is waging against the Ukraine. Also, on the subject of the treatment of working-class women during the 19th century. This is a book that's out of print, but if you can find a second-hand copy, then look out for Michael Pearson's The 5-Pound Virgins. I recommend that for an insightful, if unsettling, social history. Right, ladies and gentlemen, that is this review officially finished. Now, my video about the Barbie film seems to be benefiting from the popularity of the movie, or that's what I have to assume because it's had more views than any other video I've made so far. I also have a few more subscribers. We are up to 76 now. 76. Never thought I'd get there. Another Middlemarch Meditations is in preparation for those of you who enjoy following them. And we need to balance out all this fiction with a proper non-fiction review. If anyone is familiar with Neil MacGregor, now he is the British art historian who wrote A History of the World in 100 Objects, and that was published in 2010. He followed that in 2019 with another work which uses art to tell the story of the phenomenon of human religious belief. I look forward to sharing more with you about that soon. So thanks for joining me, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.